I'm Charlie Smith, the editor of Pancouver, and it's my pleasure to speak to Denise Fong, who's a UBC public scholar and curator of urban cultures at the Museum of Vancouver. The Museum of Vancouver has been a leader in advancing sustainability and decolonization initiatives in its sector. Denise herself was involved in an award-winning exhibition called A Seat at the Table. More recently, she is the curatorial lead on Mirage, Disused Public Property in Taiwan. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us, Denise.
Thanks for the opportunity to chat with you today, Charlie.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Can I start by asking how you became so interested in museums?
Well, it's really interesting because actually I wasn't so interested in museums when I began doing my graduate program at UBC. I have a background in anthropology and archaeology, but I always felt like museums didn't really reflect the kind of nuances and the diversity in the local communities as much. And so I think it was a fun place to kind of learn about different cultures and groups and current issues. But I think it wasn't until I really started getting immersed in the industry in 2017. I got a job working at one of the local museums that really focused on talking about the local heritage of Burnaby. And was working on the curatorial team, and one of my jobs was to kind of look into the history of Chinese Canadians in Burnaby. And one of the things that I first noticed when I was looking through the collections was that there was very little about Chinese Canadians in the contemporary context, but even in the early days, there was very few records that actually talked about Chinese Canadian experiences from a first person perspective.
Mhm.
So you may see a few photographs of Chinese Canadian farm workers, a few oral histories here and there, but that was the extent of it. So I began to see this as an issue that I wanted to delve more into as I was kind of navigating my own graduate research. And so that's how I really started to become more engaged in the work in museums.
Well, that's very interesting. You've demonstrated an interest in what's called participatory curation. And what does this term mean, participatory curation, to you?
So traditionally in museums, the curator is considered as the expert and is the person who basically leads kind of the creation of knowledge, and the exhibits and the programs that are delivered are kind of ways to kind of disseminate that knowledge to the public. But I think more and more now museums are recognizing the importance of co-curating and co-creating knowledge with people in the communities who are knowledge keepers and knowledge holders. And so my work in this realm is really focused on the relational aspects of curating. So focusing on the process of working with people rather than just focusing on the end product. So part of that is, negotiating the power dynamics, and also thinking about consciously how do we share authority in the work that we do in museums. So I think a lot of the work that I've been involved in, working with the Chinese Canadian community or communities in Vancouver and BC, has been about opening up these spaces so that people can come and be part of these processes and decision-making opportunities.
And on the Museum of Vancouver website, you're listed as Curator of Urban Cultures. And what does that position entail?
So it's a really broad title. Urban cultures is a huge topic, but in our museum we have a great team, and we work across different departments to kind of work with different community groups. For myself, the focus is really on building those relationships with local groups, and I think because of my personal research interest in working with racialized communities, that is one of the areas where I really hope to expand and look into as I continue to work in this role. And I think with this new role, it's also about understanding the needs of the groups that are engaged in this kind of cultural work and to understand ways of how we can support and uplift some of the ongoing initiatives that they're already doing. Because there's a lot of community groups out there that are already taking the lead and initiative to do their own kind of storytelling projects and documenting their own community histories. So how can museums help support some of the work that they're already doing?
Yeah, that's interesting. I saw a fascinating National Film Board um, documentary, which you probably saw, about the community archives, and one of the really articulate speakers in that was Henry Yu, and Henry, who's a UBC professor, you've worked with him obviously in the past, was involved in A Seat at the Table, and this was an exhibition co-produced by the Museum of Vancouver and UBC. And how did A Seat at the Table advance some of the themes that you've just been talking about, Denise?
So for A Seat at the Table, it actually opened around the time during the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was quite timely because the project itself focused on the history of Chinese immigration to BC. And we wanted to reflect on the richness of the heritage and histories of Chinese Canadians in BC through the lens of food. But because we also were responding to the kind of COVID-19 spurred anti-Asian racism at the time. So it was also very timely for us to include in the exhibition the important stories of historical discrimination against Chinese Canadians in the past and how that's been extended to the contemporary context. So the project was a collaboration between UBC, Museum of Vancouver, and the Chinese Canadian Museum. And so through the work of showing this exhibition in multiple locations, we got to work with a lot of different artists, local activists, community historians, and students. And we also got to work with a lot of different kinds of media. So we used visual arts. We included digital visualizations and virtual reality. We had oral histories, and we also had a lot of archival research that helped to collectively tell those stories, but also were spaces where people could kind of express their own ideas about identity and representation. So it's really interesting that despite opening during the pandemic, actually the exhibition helped bring a lot of Asian Canadian visitors and Asian visitors in general to the Museum of Vancouver, which was a huge thing for the institution because I think in the past there's always been kind of a bit of a gap in terms of the demographics that visit the museum. So that was very encouraging to hear that people were interested to come out during the pandemic
Well, you're their museum now.
to
That's
be
great.
yeah, to be there. And also the great thing about the exhibition was also giving visitors the opportunity to share their own stories. So there was like a chance for people to record their own family histories and also to write their own experiences with racism in BC and Vancouver. So it was a very wonderful process in which we were able to bring community through different ways and also engage visitors in kind of this ongoing dialogue about these issues.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you about this, Denise, is how important are these personal stories?
These personal stories, I think they help people understand the significance of these often underappreciated or under-recognized histories. Um, like we often talk about the importance of engaging with indigenous communities and recognizing those deep relationships, for instance, between Chinese and indigenous groups in BC. And so it's easy to talk about it abstractly, but as part of my PhD research, I also got to interview some folks and ask them for, their input on the significance of storytelling. And I think it really comes through when you're able to present these very personal stories, whether it's on film, whether it's through a book. But sometimes like people have the hardest time trying to convince others why it's important to consider these histories and relationships to be important and informative of our work. But show them the film, let them hear the stories from the first person perspective. And I think the perspective taking that people then can participate in after watching a film or listening to a short clip about someone sharing their experience of growing up in rural BC and making their first friend in Canada, like being their Indigenous neighbor. Like all these stories resonate with people in a very emotional way. So I think in that sense, the museum provides that platform for showing these stories to the public and making those new connections.
That's wonderful. You're also the curatorial lead on for the MOV's Mirage, Disused Public Property in Taiwan. What would you like people to know about this exhibition?
So this exhibition features 150 photographs from the collection of Yao Ruizhong, who's a award-winning Taiwanese artist. One of his projects, Mirage, went on a 10-year duration to document abandoned public spaces in Taiwan. And so these are buildings that were funded by taxpayer money as part of oftentimes political promises during elections. And so a lot of these spaces have been sitting around for 10 years, 20 years, and not being used because they were mismanaged. And part of the practice of Yao's work is to see art as a form of activism. So it was important for him to create this paper trail to showcase all of these sites. And he actually, in each year of his project, worked with his students to produce these catalogs, which he then would mail to the president's office and the government departments in Taiwan to show them the evidence of the misuse of public funds. So it was a really amazing experience working with Yao and also with the documentarian Sandy Lowe on this project, because we're able to really bring people's attention not only to Taiwan and the kind of really flourishing art scene in Taiwan, but to also think about the ways in which this project informs how we look at what's happening around us in Vancouver and other parts of the world. Because I've talked to a lot of visitors and guests who have attended the show, and they've also talked about, oh yeah, this is happening in my home country, or the show has been shown in other
I,
parts of Asia, and it's a common problem everywhere.
Denise, I thought of a couple of SkyTrain stations that were kind of underutilized when I saw it. So it did have that local. One of the things is, and you addressed this already to a certain extent, but for many years, Canadian museums didn't pay a lot of attention to Asia, even though, we're on the Pacific Rim. We have deep Asian connections going back, well over a century, almost, if you go back to Mears Island and the first arrivals, 2 centuries. And uh, I'm wondering for you, what what you think you can bring to help advance public understanding in this area.
I think I've been very privileged to have had the opportunity to work in this area of research for so many years now, working on Chinese Canadian history and working in museums and cultural spaces. So I've been invited to, for instance, participate in publication projects where these publications are shared with local public schools. I've given presentations to secondary school teachers and talked about the importance of documenting family histories in their work. And one really heartening story I received from one teacher, for instance, was after attending one of my presentations, he actually changed his his curriculum a bit and assigned the students to work on a presentation about their own family history. And then he sent me the video of the family history that one of his students did in social studies. And she basically did a very extensive interview with her grandfather. And her grandfather was so delighted that finally someone in the family took interest in the family history and wanted to talk to him and learn about, how the family got here from China and from Hong Kong and all these migration journeys. So I think it's a way in which all of us who are working in these different areas can, in our when we have the opportunity to share the impact of storytelling with people so that they can then, activate some of this work in whichever area they're doing their work in, whether it's in um, legal industry, whether it's in education, whether it's in arts. There's just so many ways in which we can do this work together.
Yeah. You didn't say media, but I think that's another example.
Absolutely.
Um, and one of the things, we're doing this project, call it Beyond Chinese, because in a way, people hear the word Chinese and it can sometimes, it could lead to stereotypes, but it can also mean many things. Some people think of it as a language or an ethnicity, a culture, a race, national boundary. I'm curious, for someone who spent so much time immersed in research and hearing stories, what goes through your mind when you hear the word Chinese?
Yeah, this is a very, very interesting and important topic that's close to my heart. I've been doing research in my own PhD studies on Chineseness and representation in museums, and I think one of the really important discoveries or findings from my own study was to see how expansive and nuanced this definition of Chineseness is for different people. And I think there's a lot of it has to do also with the fact that museums have for the longest time been um, in the business of quote unquote commodifying the sense of otherness. And so when we look at traditionally how museums have collected on different cultural groups or represented groups, it's always been centered on the interest of white curators in the past and the white donors in the past who have collected things that looked exotic and interesting to them. And so now, as we see, especially in the context of Vancouver, how rich and dynamic the Chinese community here is, what I'm seeing more and more now is this kind of pushback against these very kind of fixed storylines about what does Chinese Canadian history mean, who can qualify as a Chinese Canadian, and really challenging these kind of essentialized notions of, oh, Chinese Canadians, it's associated with Chinatown, or it's associated with certain village dialects. Like there's just been so much change over the past years in terms of how we look at it, whether it's from language perspective, whether it's from kind of a urban geography, thinking about how we extend the narrative of Chineseness beyond Chinatown, but looking at other spaces where Chinese communities have established and flourished. We look at gender representation. How do we kind of move away from kind of the binary constructs and think about also queerness in defining how Chineseness is conceived. So there's kind of this growing, expansive dialogue on what does it mean to be Chinese. And so I see this a lot expressed in kind of arts and cultural space. And so I think for me, this is still kind of a very growing and changing area for me. Like it's hard to really pinpoint what it means.
It must be an exciting time to be in your field with this kind of, almost a flourishing of appreciation and understanding of identity. One of the things I was also curious is you basically were addressing the diversity of people with Chinese ancestry, and I'm curious to know what you think museums can do, just generally speaking, not necessarily the Museum of Vancouver, to expand our understanding of this diversity.
Yeah, I think one of the things that a lot of museums are now trying to do, including MOV and other spaces, is just thinking about how museums can become more welcoming spaces for different groups and for people who are of Chinese ancestry, but also with other racialized communities. Is I think there's a general sense that we want to push back against that kind of siloing of like, we will contain the Chinese story in this section, or we will talk about the Japanese in this section, and that's kind of the extent of which their presence is recognized. And so this is not just about geographically siloing them to stories about Chinatown, but it's also a kind of temporal siloing where we only focus on the stories of kind of the first gen or second gen Chinese Canadians that arrived in the early years and kind of had those deep roots to Guangdong, southern China. But we need to kind of open up that space so that more people can see themselves reflected in the museum space. So, like when I think about some of the people that I spoke with in my research was that, folks from Hong Kong or from Taiwan, they don't necessarily associate with being Chinese. And so there's these kinds of ways in which
Or
that
even
I don't
Southeast Asia,
Southeast Asia,
like,
exactly.
yeah,
Yeah, so it's changing. And so museums need to continue to kind of be in tune with what's happening and kind of be, adapting to the
interesting.
people change.
And just I wonder, as somebody who speaks Chinese, you speak Cantonese, but I also heard you speaking Mandarin too, weren't you, at the Mirage opening? I wonder if you ever worry that some Chinese dialects are disappearing, and with that might also come a loss of culture.
Hmm. I've thought about that a lot. I know some of my colleagues in UBC have been doing a lot of research and have been building a really strong program in Cantonese language education, which is really encouraging. And I think outside of Asia, it's really important to create these contexts for using the language because I think the key part about having these languages and dialects be I guess, ongoing and being used is being able to have those connections, especially in the kind of intergenerational lens. I think in a lot of ways, people who are now interested in learning Cantonese, for instance, they want to learn because they want to communicate with elders in their family or older family members who are maybe living in Hong Kong and China, Macau, and whatnot. And it's a point of connection for them, and it's important for them to have the tools and capacity to continue these relationships with their family and their loved ones. And so I think what's really encouraging, though we are very aware that there is a threat that these languages and dialects are disappearing, but that there's also more people that are creating these different kinds of support systems and networks for these languages to be reactivated. And I'm also thinking about not just language education itself, but you also need the cultural spaces for these languages to be used in. So I think there's a lot of great work that's been done in North America by different activist groups that are focusing not just on language itself, but also importance of revitalizing heritage practices that will support kind of that interest and the cultural learning because I think learning about the heritage and culture goes hand in hand with learning about the language itself. So I think it's a concern, but I also see that there are a lot of folks now that are collectively working towards providing these ways for accessing language learning.
It's interesting how you kind of see language and culture being almost intertwined, that you can't have one without the other. And um, I'm also wondering what your goals are. You've done a lot already in a relatively short period of time. What are your goals as a curator over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I've still got a lot to learn. I think there's so much going on in the world and also in the museum field itself that I'd really like to, learn more about. And I think as an industry, we are always struggling with being under-resourced. But I really do hope that if in the future years we can build more sustainable relationships with different groups that can leverage the strength of different parties, but also hopefully in some way I and others can contribute to help the industry become more appealing to the next generation. I think there's always a challenge of trying to find work in Vancouver that supports, a reasonable standard of living, but also gives people the space to pursue their interests. And I think especially in this industry, it's not really paid very well compared to a lot of other private corporations and technology fields and whatnot. And so for folks who are really passionate about this work, I really hope that some of the work that we're doing can really help pave a bit of a pathway or a better foundation for them to continue this work. This is ongoing work that needs to be done, and there will be more stories that need to be recorded and showcased, and new relationships to be built. So I think there's a lot to look forward to.
I'll give a shout out to, if any people with deep pockets are watching, you could donate to the Museum of Vancouver and help continue this important work. One last thing I'd like to ask, is there anything you'd like to share about your background, cultural heritage, that informs your work as a curator, Denise?
Um, I would say specifically in my work in Chinese Canadian history and working in museums, it's been very interesting to see kind of the diversity of what it means to be Chinese and what Chineseness can mean for different people. I grew up, I was born in Hong Kong, but I grew up in Richmond. And so I have a very particular way of upbringing in Richmond where I was surrounded by a lot of um, I guess, early 1980s, 1990s immigrants from Hong Kong, predominantly maybe conservative, religious background. And so I have a very particular view of Chineseness when I first started working in the field. And but also because of that, because of growing up in Richmond, I was able to um, have the proper kind of cultural context to continue using Cantonese as my kind of day-to-day language of use. And so I think in many ways it's been a really good foundation for me to continue to kind of expand on the work that I'm now doing in other parts of Greater Vancouver and seeing how everyone's experience has been different. So I think I would just encourage anyone who's interested in working in this area to kind of not forget about your roots and to find ways in which your own unique experience, your own unique language skills and relationships and connections with your own community can help inform your work that you're doing in the arts and cultural space today.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Denise, for sharing your insights and your expertise. I've been speaking to Denise Fong. She's the curator of urban cultures at the Museum of Vancouver.
Thank you, Charlie.